You think anybody in this room gives a damn about you, sweetheart? Sheriff Dale Morrison's voice cut through the diner like a blade, and then the sound that stopped time. The crack of his open hand against Emily Harper's face echoed off every wall. Nobody moved. Nobody breathed, except the man in the corner booth. He didn't rush. He didn't shout. He simply set down his coffee cup and stood up. If you've ever been invisible, overlooked, or told your pain doesn't matter, this story is for you. Subscribe right now, drop your city in the comments, and don't you dare look away. The morning of October 14th started exactly the way every other morning started for Emily Harper. Her alarm went off at 4:47 a.m. She didn't hit snooze. She hadn't hit snooze in years. Snooze was a luxury for people who had something worth staying in bed for. Emily had a shift. She had rent due on Friday. She had a uniform that needed ironing and a pair of shoes with a sole that was starting to separate at the toe. And she'd been meaning to fix it with super glue for 2 weeks, but kept forgetting to buy the super glue. And somehow that little detail, that tiny stupid detail, was the thing that made her feel most tired every single morning when she stood at the bathroom mirror and looked at herself. 29 years old, blonde hair she kept in a practical ponytail, blue eyes that people used to tell her were beautiful back when people said things like that to her. She had the kind of face that looked young when she smiled and older than her years when she didn't. She mostly didn't. Lou's Diner sat right off Route 58 on the eastern edge of Bakersfield, California. One of those places that had been there so long, the locals stopped seeing it. The sign had a burned-out letter. The booths were patched with electrical tape. The coffee was the color of motor oil and tasted about as smooth, but people kept coming back because Lou kept the portions generous and the prices honest, and in a town where a lot of things were neither of those that counted for something. Emily had been working at Lou's for 3 years. Before that, she'd waitressed at a Denny's down the highway. Before that, she'd spent 8 months trying to get out from under a relationship that had left marks in places that didn't show on the outside. She didn't talk about that. She talked about the weather, about the pie specials, about how the Dodgers were doing. She smiled when people needed her to smile. She refilled your cup before you asked. She was very, very good at being easy to overlook. By 6:30, the morning rush was already building. Truckers at the counter. A couple of retired men sharing a newspaper at the window booth. 2 women from the processing plant down the road who came in every Tuesday. The usual orbit of Bakersfield life rotating around coffee and eggs in the particular comfort of a place that never changed. Emily was moving between tables, a full pot of coffee in one hand and an order pad tucked in her apron when the door opened. She heard it before she saw it. The sound of boots hitting linoleum with the specific rhythm of someone who was used to rooms rearranging themselves when they walked in. Sheriff Dale Morrison. She felt the shift in the room immediately. Not everyone looked up, but everyone registered it. The 2 women from the plant dropped their voices. One of the truckers at the counter found something very interesting to study in his coffee cup. Even the retired men folded their newspaper a little tighter. Morrison was 53 years old, broad across the shoulders, with a silver star pinned to his chest that he wore like a crown. He had the face of a man who had spent decades being told he was important, and he'd believed every word of it. He moved through public spaces like they belonged to him because in Kern County, in a lot of ways they did. He'd been sheriff for 11 years. He had the district attorney in his pocket. He had city councilmen who returned his calls before they returned their wives. He had a reputation that people spoke about carefully in low voices in places where they were sure he couldn't hear them. He slid into the booth nearest the door, not because it was the best booth, but because it was the one that gave him the clearest view of everyone else. Emily took a breath, walked over. "Good morning, Sheriff. Coffee?" He didn't look at her. He was scrolling through his phone jaw, said something clearly working on his last nerve. "Yeah, and tell whoever's cooking back there that I want my eggs right this time. Last time they were runny. I don't eat runny eggs." "Yes, sir. I'll make sure." She poured his coffee. She walked to the window, put in his order, came back to check on the other tables. Normal, routine. Just another morning. She should have known. Mornings like that never stayed normal when Morrison was in the room. It was about 15 minutes later when it started. Emily was delivering plates to the truckers at the counter when she heard Morrison's voice rise from the booth. Hey, I'm talking to you." She turned. He was holding up his coffee cup, and his face had gone the particular shade of red that she'd learned over 3 years meant that something small was about to become something very large. She went over immediately. I'm sorry, do you need a refill? I needed one 10 minutes ago, he said. Where have you been? Standing around talking. I was serving other tables, sir. I'll get you a refill right now. You know what your problem is? He set the cup down hard enough that coffee sloshed over the rim. You people think this job is just walking around looking pretty. It's not. It's paying attention. It's doing what you're here to do. You people. She felt the words land but kept her face still. This was a skill she'd spent years developing. I apologize. Let me get you a fresh cup. She turned to go, and that was when he said it. You know I've heard about you. His voice carried now loud enough for the whole room. Heard you used to work down at the Denny's till they let you go. Heard you got a history of causing problems wherever you go. That true? Emily stopped. The back of her neck went cold. She turned back around slowly. I left the Denny's on my own terms, Sheriff. That's not what I heard. He leaned back, arms crossed, the way men lean back when they're enjoying themselves. I heard you were trouble. I heard you've got a record. Nothing violent, but still. He paused, letting it hang in the air, watching to see if she'd flinch. You want to keep this job. You might want to remember who's got influence in this town. The room was very quiet. Not the comfortable quiet of early morning. The held breath quiet of a room full of people who were pretending not to watch something happen. Emily's hands were trembling. She was working hard to keep her voice level. Sheriff Morrison, I don't care what you think. He cut her off flatly. Go get my eggs, and when you bring them, don't make me wait. She went. She filled his cup. She put it in the order again, even though the eggs were already on the grill. She walked back to the counter and stood there for a moment with her back to the room, and she breathed and she reminded herself that this was just another morning and that people like Morrison always moved on eventually, and that she just needed to get through the next hour. She got through the next 20 minutes. Then his food came out. She carried the plate over herself, set it down carefully, everything exactly as ordered. Eggs over medium, whole wheat toast, side of fruit. He looked at the plate. He picked up his fork. He cut into the eggs. The yolk ran, just barely, just a fraction past where it should have been. Maybe 30 seconds too long or 30 seconds too short. Emily genuinely couldn't tell you which. But the yolk ran, and Morrison looked at it, and then he looked up at her, and the red in his face deepened into something she hadn't seen before. I told you, he said. I told you no runny eggs. I'm so sorry, I'll have them remake it right away. Are you stupid? He said it quietly. That was the thing that caught her off guard. He didn't shout it. He said it almost conversationally, the way you'd point out that someone had a smudge on their shirt. Are you actually stupid, or do you just not listen? Sheriff, I'll fix this. You know what you are. He stood up from the booth, and he was a big man, and she took one involuntary step back. You're exactly what's wrong with this town. Lazy, entitled, walking around here like you deserve to be treated with some kind of respect when you can't even cook an egg right. I didn't cook it, sir. I'm a waitress. Don't you talk back to me. I'm not talking back. I'm explaining. I said don't. And then his hand moved. It happened so fast that Emily's brain didn't fully process it as real until she felt the sting along the left side of her face, the sharp heat spreading from her cheekbone to her jaw, the way her head turned with the force of it. The sound was enormous in the small space, a crack flat and final like a door slamming shut on something that could never be undone. The diner went absolutely silent. Emily stood very still. Her hand came up to her face almost without her deciding to do it, pressing against the place where he'd hit her. She could feel the heat even through her fingers. Her eyes were burning. She was not going to cry. She refused to cry. Not here, not in front of him, not in front of everyone. Morrison straightened his jacket. Next time, he said, his voice completely calm, completely controlled, when I tell you how I want my eggs, you listen. Nobody moved. One of the women from the plant had her hand over her mouth. The truckers at the counter were rigid, staring at the surface in front of them. The retired men in the window booth had gone pale. Lou himself was visible through the service window, frozen at the grill, spatula in hand. Nobody said a word, except one person. The sound of a coffee cup being set down, deliberately, slowly, and then the sound of a man rising from a corner booth. Emily hadn't noticed him when she came in. He'd been sitting in the far corner, back to the wall, the booth half in shadow. A big man in a black leather jacket with the kind of stillness about him that made you somehow not look directly at him. He had gray at his temples and a jaw that looked like it had been carved rather than grown, and he had been working quietly on his breakfast for the better part of 40 minutes, and absolutely no one in the room had paid him any mind. He was paying mine now. He stood up slowly. He was tall, well over 6 feet and broad in the way of a man who had spent his entire life doing physical things, and the leather jacket he wore had a patch on the back with a logo that several people in the room recognized immediately. And when they recognized it, their expression shifted from fear into something more complicated. He walked across the diner floor toward Morrison's booth. Not fast, not aggressive, just steady and certain, like a man who has never once in his life had to rush to make a point. Morrison watched him come. "Can I help you, pal?" The man stopped when he was close enough that Morrison had to look up at him. He looked at Morrison for a moment, just looked at him with eyes that were the color of a November sky and about as warm, and then he looked at Emily, and something crossed his face that was careful and quiet and had a particular kind of fury in it that was nothing like rage and everything like judgment. Then he looked back at Morrison. "You just hit that woman," he said. His voice was low, the kind of low that carries further than a shout because everyone around you goes very quiet to hear it. Morrison squared his shoulders. "And who are you supposed to be?" "My name is Jack Donovan." A pause. "People call me Grim." The name landed. Emily saw it register in Morrison's face, a flicker quickly controlled. A man like Morrison would know that name. In certain circles in this part of California, that name meant something specific. "That's supposed to mean something to me," Morrison said. "It means I was sitting right over there," Grim said, "and I watched you put your hand on this woman, and I watched every person in this room decide not to see it." He let that sit for a moment. "That's how you've been running things around here, isn't it? People see things and decide not to see them because they're scared of you. I'd watch your mouth very carefully." "I've been watching yours all morning." Grim's voice didn't change. "You came in here and you talked to her like she was nothing, like she owed you something just for being in the same room. And when that wasn't enough, you hit her." He tilted his head slightly, "in front of witnesses." Morrison let out a short, hard laugh. "You know what you're doing right now? You're interfering with a law enforcement officer. That's a crime. You committed a crime about 30 seconds ago." "My word against hers." Morrison glanced around the room. "And hers against everyone in here who didn't see a thing. Did you?" He raised his voice to the room. "Did anyone in here see anything?" Silence. The truckers stared at the counter. The women from the plant looked at their plates. Lou had disappeared entirely from the service window. Morrison turned back with a thin smile. "See, nobody saw anything. That's how things work here, son. You might want to think about whether you really want to make yourself a problem in this town." Grim looked at him for a long moment. Then he reached into his jacket pocket, slowly, deliberately, and set his phone on the table between them. "Recording started about 22 minutes ago," he said. The smile left Morrison's face. "Audio and video," Grim continued, "mounted in the corner. You were in frame the entire time." The room was so quiet that Emily could hear her own heartbeat. Morrison looked at the phone. He looked at Grim. Something was moving behind his eyes. Calculations, risk assessments, the particular math of a man who has always been able to make problems disappear, trying to figure out whether this one was disappearable. "That's not admissible." "I'm not a cop," Grim said. "I don't need it to be admissible. I need it to be on the internet." He picked up his phone. "And depending on the next 30 seconds, that's where it's going." Morrison's jaw tightened. "You have no idea what you're doing." "I have a pretty clear idea." Grim turned to Emily. He looked at her directly and his voice shifted just slightly, just enough into something that was quieter and less hard. "Are you all right?" Emily realized she still had her hand pressed against her face. She lowered it. She straightened up. There was a tremor in her hands that she couldn't entirely control, but her voice, when she found it, came out steadier than she expected. "No," she said. "I'm not all right." "Okay." He nodded like that was exactly the right answer. "Then let's do something about that." Morrison stepped forward. "You're making a very serious mistake." "Sheriff." Grim turned to look at him, and there was something in his face so completely without fear that it stopped Morrison mid-step. "You ran this room on fear for 11 years. Every person in here who looked away this morning, that's your work. That's what you built. He looked around the room slowly, and his gaze passed over each face that was turned down, each pair of eyes avoiding the scene. But you made one mistake today. He looked back at Morrison. You did it in front of me. He set his spaghetti money on the nearest table, exact amount neatly folded, and turned back to Emily. I'm going to step outside and make a call. I'd like you to stay right here. Don't let anyone tell you to leave. Don't let anyone tell you to be quiet about what happened, and don't sign anything anyone puts in front of you. He paused. Can you do that? Emily looked at him. She looked at the calm steadiness in his face. Not kindness exactly, more like certainty, and she felt something shift inside her. Something that had been very tightly coiled for a very long time. I can do that, she said. Grimm nodded. Then he walked past Morrison, past the sheriff of Kern County, past the man who had just committed a crime in a room full of people who had all decided not to see it, and he walked out the front door without looking back. Morrison stood in the middle of the diner. His face was doing something complicated. He looked around the room, and for the first time, Emily watched him become uncertain. Watched him try to find the fear in people's faces and find it mixed now with something else. Something new. Witnesses, she realized. Not just scared people. Witnesses who had all just heard that they'd been filmed. Morrison pointed a finger at Emily. This isn't over, he said quietly. No, she agreed. It's not. He walked out. The bell over the door chimed behind him. For about 5 seconds, the diner held its collective breath. Then one of the truckers at the counter, a big man named Terry, who came in 3 times a week and always ordered the same thing, cleared his throat. You okay, honey? He said. And Emily Harper, who had been waking up at 4:47 a.m. for years without once crying about it, who had learned to make herself small, in rooms where she might take up too much space, who had spent the last 20 minutes being dressed down in front of a full diner by a man who had never once in his life been held accountable for anything. Emily Harper pressed her lips together and nodded and did not cry, and thought not this time. Through the window, she could see Grimm standing just outside the door, phone to his ear, his back straight, talking to someone with the quiet precision of a man who knew exactly who to call. She didn't know who he was calling. She didn't know what was coming. She didn't know that by the time the lunch shift started, there would be a reporter parked outside. She didn't know that by evening, Morrison would file paperwork to have her arrested on charges no one in the diner would recognize as real. She didn't know that in 72 hours, the video from that phone would have been seen by 2 million people. She knew one thing. For the first time in a very long time, someone had stood up, and she was still standing. The phone behind the counter rang. Lou came back to the service window, pale but present, and he looked at Emily and he said, quietly, roughly, like it cost him something. Your shift's paid for today. Full shift. You don't have to stay if you don't want. Emily looked around the diner, at Terry and the other truckers who were watching her now with open faces, at the women from the plant who had both turned to face her fully, at the old retired men in the window booth, one of whom had pulled out his own phone and was looking at it with the particular expression of a man deciding something. She straightened her apron. She picked up the coffee pot. I'll stay, she said. The afternoon that followed the slap was the strangest of Emily Harper's life, and she'd had some strange afternoons. By noon, Lou's diner had more people in it than it had seen on a weekday since the highway bypass opened 3 years back. Not because anyone was especially hungry, because word travels in a small city the way smoke travels low to the ground fast and into every crack. People came and ordered coffee they didn't need and sat there looking at Emily the way you look at something you can't quite believe is real. She could feel their eyes on the left side of her face. The mark had faded from red to something more muted, but it was still there if you knew to look, and everyone in that diner knew exactly where to look. She kept moving, kept refilling cups, kept saying, "You're welcome," and "I'll be right back," and all the words a waitress says when she is performing the role of someone who is completely fine. She was not completely fine. Grimm had come back inside after his phone call, settled back into his corner booth, and ordered a slice of pie he barely touched. He didn't approach her again, didn't hover, just sat there in that particular stillness of his, and the fact of him sitting there, this large, calm, leather-jacketed man, with a name that people said carefully, made the diner feel different, safer in a way she couldn't entirely explain and didn't fully trust yet. Around 2 in the afternoon, a woman Emily didn't recognize came through the door. Mid-40s blazer, sensible shoes, a press badge clipped to her lapel. She sat at the counter and ordered coffee and looked around the room with the professional attention of someone who cataloged details for a living. Emily went over to take her order. "You're Emily Harper," the woman said. Not a question. "I am. Sandra Reeves, Bakersfield, Californian." She put a business card on the counter. "I heard what happened this morning. I'd like to talk to you if you are willing." Emily looked at the card, looked at the woman. "I don't have anything to say right now." "That's okay." Sandra pushed the card forward slightly. "When you do call me, day or night." She paused. "For what it's worth, I've been covering Dale Morrison for 6 years. This isn't the first complaint against him. It's just the first one with footage." That landed somewhere in Emily's chest like a stone dropping into still water. "What do you mean it's not the first?" she said. Sandra's expression was careful. "There are people in this county who've tried to come forward before. About Morrison. Things that happened to them, things they witnessed. 3 of them withdrew their statements before anything got to a courtroom. 1 of them moved out of state." She let that sit for exactly 2 seconds. "I'm not saying that to scare you. I'm saying it so you understand what you're dealing with." Emily understood. She'd grown up in Bakersfield. She knew what Morrison was. She'd just always assumed it would never be her problem because she was very careful and very quiet and very good at not being noticed. She picked up the business card and put it in her apron pocket. Sandra drank her coffee, left a generous tip, and walked out. Grim was watching from the corner booth. When Emily glanced at him, he gave a single nod. "Balanazan." Just that, like I saw, like good. The shift ended at 4. Emily collected her things from the back, changed out of her uniform, and stood at the back door for a moment. She had a 2009 Honda Civic with a dent in the rear bumper and $42 in her checking account until Friday. She had a studio apartment 8 blocks away. She had tomorrow's shift starting at 6:30. She pushed open the door and walked out. A patrol car was parked directly behind her Honda. 2 deputies she didn't recognize were leaning against it. Her stomach dropped. The taller of the 2 straightened up. "Emily Harper." "Yes. We need you to come with us." She didn't move. "What for?" "There's been a complaint filed. We just need you to come to the station and answer some questions." "What kind of complaint?" The deputy's expression didn't flicker. "A complaint about an altercation at this establishment this morning?" "Specifically." He glanced at the paper in his hand, and something in the formality of it, the rehearsed quality of the gesture, told Emily everything. "A complaint that you behaved in a threatening and erratic manner toward a law enforcement officer and that you may have been under the influence of a controlled substance at the time." The words hit her like cold water. "That's not what happened," she said. Her voice came out very steady, which surprised her. "Ma'am, we just need you to come to the station." "Do you have a warrant?" A beat. The deputy's jaw tightened. "This is voluntary at this point." "Then I'm voluntarily declining." She looked at him directly. "And I'd like you to move your car so I can get to mine." She heard footsteps behind her and turned. Grim was standing at the back door of the diner. He'd followed her out, or maybe he'd been watching. Maybe he'd anticipated exactly this, and he had his phone in his hand, and he was filming, and when the deputies saw the phone, something shifted in their body language. Not a retreat, but a recalculation. "Ma'am," the first deputy said again, his voice cooling, "we strongly recommend—" "She heard you," Grim said from the doorway. His voice was pleasant, completely pleasant. "She gave you her answer." A long silence, the kind that has a decision inside it. The deputies got in the car. They moved it. Emily got in her Honda and sat there for a moment with her hands on the wheel and her heart going at about twice its normal rate. And then she looked in the rearview mirror and watched the patrol car pull away, and she thought, this is not going to stop. She was right. She drove the 8 blocks home and found a note tucked under her apartment door. It wasn't signed. It was printed on plain paper. It said, "You should think about whether Bakersfield is still the right place for you." She stood in the hallway and read it twice. Then she took a photo of it with her phone and texted it to the number Grim had given her before she left the diner. His response came back in under a minute. "Don't throw it away. Don't open your door to anyone you don't know tonight. I'm sending someone to your building." She typed back, "I'm not in witness protection. I don't need a guard." He typed, "It's not protection, it's company. There's a difference." She sat on her couch in her small apartment, still in her street clothes, and looked at the note on her coffee table. and thought about Sandra Reeves saying 3 of them withdrew their statements. Thought about the deputy reading from his paper in that practiced way. Thought about the word erratic. Thought about the word influence. She knew what Morrison was doing. She'd seen versions of it before on a smaller scale with smaller men. You don't come after someone directly, not right away. First, you rewrite the story. First, you make them the problem. First, you get everyone around them wondering whether they're really as stable as they seem, whether there's history there, whether maybe there are 2 sides to this. Her phone buzzed. A different number this time. She almost didn't answer. Emily Harper. A man's voice. Professional, brisk, no nonsense. My name is David Keller. I'm an attorney. Jack Donovan asked me to call you. She closed her eyes briefly. He works fast. He does. I've reviewed the footage he sent me. I want to be straight with you about where things stand because I don't think you need anyone softening it. A pause. What Morrison did this morning is criminal assault. It doesn't matter that he's a sheriff. It's on video, it happened in front of witnesses, and it was unprovoked. That's a strong foundation. But he filed first. The complaint he filed against you, the erratic behavior, the implied substance issue, it's nonsense, but it's on record now. That's intentional. He's trying to get ahead of this, muddy the water before the footage goes wide. Has it gone wide? A pause. Jack held it. He's waiting to see what you want to do. That surprised her. He's asking me, it's your story, Ms. Harper. He understands that. You can walk away. Morrison walks too, most likely, but you walk safe. Or we can take this forward, and I need you to understand what forward looks like. It's not going to be a clean fight. A man like Morrison doesn't go quietly. Another pause, and she could hear something in the attorney's voice that was careful and honest at the same time. He's going to come after your past. Whatever's in it, and I'm not asking you to tell me right now, he's going to find it, and he's going to put it in front of anyone who'll listen. Emily was quiet for a moment. There's an ex, she said. The relationship I was in before I came to Bakersfield. It got bad, I left. There are police reports, but they're in my favor. I was the one who called. He threatened me, though, publicly, online, said things about me. She paused. Morrison could use that to make me look unstable. He will use it. I'm not going to pretend otherwise. Keller's voice was steady. Can I ask you something? Go ahead. If this had happened to someone else, if you'd been sitting in that diner this morning and you'd watched it happen to another woman, what would you want her to do? The question sat in the air of her apartment for a long moment. Fight, she said. Then that's what we're going to do. The next morning, Emily showed up for her shift at 6:30. The patrol car was there again. Different deputies this time, parked directly across the street, not blocking anything technically within their rights, obviously there. She walked past it without looking at it and went through the front door. Lou met her at the coffee station. He was a big man. Lou Greek family had run the diner for 30 years, wore the same style of apron every day, had never once in Emily's 3 years there said anything that wasn't either about food or the weather. He looked at her for a moment. Then he said, "You want them gone?" The patrol car. "I know people, not Morrison's people. Other people." He said it carefully, like he was choosing each word off a shelf. "I've been looking away from things in this town for a long time. I'm not proud of it." He met her eyes. "I'd like to stop looking away." Emily felt something tighten in her throat. "Keep the diner open," she said. "That's what I need from you. Don't let anyone pressure you into closing early or asking me to take time off or anything like that." Lou nodded. "I can do that. And if anyone from the county health department shows up with an inspection they didn't schedule, call David Keller." She put the attorney's card on the counter. Lou looked at the card. "You've got an attorney already." "I've got a lot of things I didn't have 2 days ago." She poured herself a coffee and started her morning. By 8 a.m., the reporter Sandra was back, this time with a photographer. By 8:30, a second reporter had arrived from a Fresno station. By 9, Emily counted 3 people in the diner who were clearly not there for breakfast. They had the particular look of people waiting for something to happen, phones face up on the table, eyes tracking the room. The diner had become a stage. She understood that. She didn't love it. Grimm arrived at 9:15, not alone this time. He came in with 2 other men, both large, both in leather jackets with the same patch on the back. They took 3 stools at the counter, ordered breakfast, and said very little. They didn't need to say anything. The patrol car across the street had 2 deputies in it. The three men at the counter were the answer to the patrol car. Emily brought them coffee without being asked. Grim looked at her face. You sleep some. You talked to Kella last night. He's good, Grim said. I've used him before. He's honest, which in this county is rarer than it should be. He said you held the footage. Grim nodded. I wasn't going to put that out without your say-so. What happened to you isn't a content strategy, it's your life. She looked at him for a moment. She'd been trying to figure him out since yesterday morning, and she wasn't much closer. He didn't fit any category she had for him. She'd expected she didn't know what she'd expected. Something louder. Something that needed more room. Why, she asked. Why do you care? You don't know me. He was quiet for a moment, turning his coffee cup in his hands. I had a daughter, he said. She'd have been about your age. He said it simply without performance, without asking for a reaction. Just a fact. She was the kind of person who apologized when people bumped into her, spent her whole life making herself small enough not to bother anyone. He looked up. I spent a lot of years thinking that was just who she was. I didn't understand that someone had taught her to be that way. Emily didn't ask what happened to her. The past tense was answer enough. I'm not her, Emily said quietly. I know you're not. He picked up his coffee, but you flinched the same way. At 10:47 that morning, Emily's phone rang with a number she didn't recognize. She almost let it go to voicemail. She answered on the third ring. The voice on the other end was female, older, shaking slightly with the particular tremor of someone who had been working up the nerve to make a call for a long time. Is this Emily Harper, the waitress? It is. I saw the news this morning. They're saying things about you that you were aggressive, that you started it. I know they're lying. A breath. Because he did the same thing to me 3 years ago in a county building. I was a clerk. A pause. I filed a complaint and it disappeared. I was told it would be better if I didn't push it. Emily gripped the phone. What's your name? Carol Briggs. I'm still here in Kern County. I never left because I didn't want him to think he ran me out. Her voice steadied as she spoke. If you're going to fight this, I want to stand with you. I want my name on record this time. Emily pressed her hand flat against the counter to stop the trembling. Carol, she said, stay on the line. I'm going to hand you to an attorney. She found Keller's number and made the connection, and as she stood there facilitating the call between a frightened woman she'd never met and the attorney who was building the case that might change both their lives, she felt something clarify inside her. Something that hadn't been clear in a long time. This was no longer just about the slap. It never really had been. At noon, Morrison himself made a move she hadn't anticipated. He gave a press statement from the steps of the county courthouse surrounded by deputies in uniform, and he was calm and composed and said the words that she knew were coming, but that still landed like a fist. I have deep concerns about the mental stability of the individual making allegations against me. I understand she has a history of volatile behavior, and I think that context is important for the public to understand as they evaluate what is being said. Someone in the diner had the press conference live on their phone, and they held it up loud enough for the room to hear, and the room went very quiet. Emily stood at the counter. Every face in the room was watching her. She looked at Grim. He was watching her with those November eyes, saying nothing, leaving the space completely open. She set down the coffee pot. She walked to the center of the diner. She looked around at the reporters, the regulars, the strangers Lou behind the service window. He's going to keep doing that, she said clearly enough for everyone to hear, using my past to make me the problem. I want you all to know there is history. There was a bad relationship. There were hard years. I'm not going to pretend otherwise because he's going to find it anyway. She paused. But none of that changes what this camera saw. None of that changes what every person in this room saw yesterday morning. A long silence. Then Terry the trucker from yesterday said, I saw it. One of the women from the plant. I saw it. The retired man from the window booth. I saw it too. One by one, not loud, not dramatic, just clear and real, and each one landing in the room like something solid. Lou came out from behind the service window. He stood behind the counter, took off his apron, folded it over his arm. I saw it, he said, and I should have said something yesterday before it got to where it got. That's on me. Emily looked at the room, at all these people who had been too afraid to speak yesterday morning and were choosing each in their own way to speak now. She picked the coffee pot back up. She went back to work. But in her apron pocket, next to Sandra Reeves' business card and David Keller's number, was Carol Briggs's phone number. And Emily knew that Carol was not the last call she was going to receive. Not even close. Morrison had made his move. He had reframed the story, tried to put her on defense, tried to make this about her instead of about him. What he hadn't counted on was that she'd already stopped being on defense. And he hadn't counted on the fact that behind every woman who'd stayed quiet in this county, there was a reason she'd stayed quiet, and reasons, when they finally get named, have a way of becoming very loud. Carol Briggs was not the last call, not even close. By Thursday morning, 3 days after the slap, David Keller's office had received 11 separate contacts from people in Kern County who said some version of the same thing. I saw something, I know something, I've been afraid to say it. 7 of them were women. 3 were men who had witnessed things happen to women they knew. One was a former deputy who had left the department 2 years ago and hadn't been able to sleep right since. Keller called Emily that morning while she was getting ready for her shift. She had the phone wedged between her ear and her shoulder, pulling her hair into its ponytail, looking at herself in the bathroom mirror the way she did every morning, except that the person looking back at her felt incrementally less like someone just getting through the day. 11 people, she said. 11 confirmed, more who called and hung up. Keller's voice had that careful quality she'd already learned to read, the one that meant he was managing how much to tell her at once. Emily, I need you to understand something. This is growing faster than I expected, and that's good, but it also means Morrison is going to feel the pressure, and when men like him feel pressure, they don't retreat, they accelerate. What does accelerate look like? It looks like what happened in yesterday, but louder. He's going to try to discredit the witnesses. He's going to find something on Carol Briggs' old debt family issue, anything, and he's going to leak it, and he's going to go after you harder. A pause. Has anything happened at your apartment? Another note Tuesday night. I photographed it. Good. Anything else? She hesitated. My landlord called me yesterday, said he'd received a noise complaint from a neighbor. I've lived there 2 years. I've never had a noise complaint. Keller was quiet for a moment. He's starting to squeeze the edges of your life, make things difficult in small ways so you're constantly putting out fires instead of focusing on the case. His voice sharpened. Don't respond to the landlord yet. Let me make a call. She put the phone down and finished getting ready and walked the 8 blocks to Lou's, and the patrol car was not across the street that morning, and somehow that felt worse than when it had been there. At least when she could see it, she knew where it was. Grimm's bike was parked outside the diner. Just the one today. He was at the counter, not the corner booth, which was the first change she'd noticed in his routine. He had a newspaper in front of him, actual paper folded to the local section, and when she came in, he pushed it across the counter without a word. The headline was below the fold. Sheriff Morrison calls for independent review of diner incident, cites concern for deputy welfare. She read it twice. He's calling for an independent review of an incident where he hit me. Review board he appoints, investigators who report to him. Grimm's voice was flat. It's a delay tactic. If he can get a review process started, he can argue that any other legal action should wait for the results. Can he actually do that? He can try. Keller's already filed to block it. He turned his coffee cup. There's something else in there. Page 4. She turned to page 4. A small item, almost buried sources close to the Kern County Sheriff's Department, suggests that District Attorney Robert Vail will hold a press conference Friday to address what he calls the coordinated media campaign against a dedicated public servant. She looked up. Vail is getting involved. Vail has been involved since day one, so Morrison doesn't make moves without talking to Vail first. That's how they've operated for at least 8 years. Grimm's jaw was tight. Vail controls what gets prosecuted in this county. If he decides your case doesn't move forward, it doesn't move forward. Keller can push, but Vail can stall, and stalling in a case like this lets people get scared and go home, Emily finished. That's right. She put the newspaper down. She tied her apron. She started her morning. At 10 a.m., Sandra Reeves came in again, this time with a colleague from the paper. They sat in the corner booth. Grimm had moved to the counter, quietly ceding the space, and Sandra waved Emily over during a lull. I need to ask you something directly, Sandra said. The footage Grimm took, are you going to release it? I'm talking to my attorney about timing. Morrison's press conference is tomorrow. Vale's is also tomorrow. If the footage isn't public before those press conferences, they control the first 24 hours of the national news cycle. Sandra's voice wasn't pushy. It was the voice of someone laying out facts. Once they set the narrative that this is a troubled woman with an agenda against a dedicated law enforcement officer, you spend the next 2 weeks fighting that instead of the actual case. Emily looked at her. You've done this before. Covered it, yes. I've watched it happen the same way 4 times in this county in 6 years. Sandra leaned forward slightly. The footage changes everything. It is undeniable. Morrison, in his own words, his own actions filmed by a witness who had no stake in the outcome. The moment that goes national, he can't walk it back. Emily was quiet for a moment. Then, what does going national actually look like for me, personally? Sandra didn't hesitate. It means your name is everywhere, your face, your past. Everything Morrison has been digging up comes out, but so does the truth. You lose privacy that you don't get back. A pause. It also means 11 people who have been afraid to come forward suddenly have a much harder time being ignored. Emily thought about Carol Briggs's voice on the phone, the way it had shaken and then steadied. She thought about the former deputy who couldn't sleep. I'll call Keller, she said. She made the call from the back of the diner standing near the supply shelves, her voice low. Keller listened. When she finished, he was quiet for exactly 4 seconds. If we release it today, before their press conferences, we control the frame, he said. Morrison becomes the story, not you. Another pause. I want to be honest with you. Once this goes national, my ability to protect your privacy is very limited. Journalists will find your ex. They'll find the old police reports. They'll find whatever Morrison's people have been planting. All of it comes out. I know. And you're okay with that. She thought about standing in the center of the diner 2 days ago, saying out loud to a room full of people, there was a bad relationship. There were hard years. She thought about how it had felt to say it before anyone could use it against her, like pulling a nail out of a wall before someone could throw the wall at you. Release it, she said. The footage went up at 11:43 a.m. on a Thursday. By 1 p.m., it had been viewed 400,000 times. By 3 p.m., it was over 2 million. By the time Emily's shift ended at 4, 3 national news networks had called Keller's office, a morning talk show had reached out through Sandra, and someone from a senator's office in Sacramento had sent an email that Keller described as carefully worded but unmistakably concerned. The comments on the footage were running about 90% in Emily's direction and 10% in Morrison's, and that 10% was loud and vicious and included 2 comments that Keller immediately flagged as potential threats and forwarded to the FBI tip line, which was itself a sentence Emily had never expected to be relevant to her life. Grimm sat at the counter and watched it unfold with an expression that was not satisfaction exactly, but something close. Vindication, maybe. The particular feeling of a man who bet on the right thing and watched it land. You should go home and sleep, he told Emily when she came to collect her jacket. Tomorrow is going to be worse than today. Worse how? Louder, he said, which in this context means better. But loud is exhausting. He paused. My guys will have eyes on your building tonight. You won't see them, but they're there. She looked at him. I keep not knowing how to thank you for this. Don't, he said, not unkindly. I'm not doing it for thanks. I'm doing it because it's right. He picked up his coffee. There's a difference. Took me most of my life to learn it, but there is one. She went home. She did not sleep well. At 2:17 in the morning, her phone lit up with a text from an unknown number. You think you won something. You haven't won anything yet. Ask Morrison about the storage unit in Shafter. Ask him what's in it. She stared at the message for a long time. Then she screenshotted it and sent it to Keller. His response came at 2:29. I'm awake. Don't respond. Where did this come from? She typed. Unknown number. Could be a setup. He typed back, could be. Could also be someone who wants to talk but is too scared to do it through official channels. I'll trace what I can. Try to sleep. She put the phone face down and lay in the dark and thought about a storage unit in Shafter, which was a small town about 15 miles outside Bakersfield. And she thought about what a man like Morrison might keep somewhere off-site and off-record. And she thought about the former deputy who couldn't sleep, and she thought, what did you see? She called Keller at 7 in the morning before she went in for her shift. The Shafter message, she said without preamble. Did you find anything? I made some calls last night. His voice had a particular quality controlled, but underneath it something that was trying not to be urgent. There is a storage facility in Shafter. I can't confirm Morrison has a unit there without a subpoena, and getting a subpoena in Kern County goes through a judge who Morrison has in his pocket. Has had dinner with 17 times in the last 2 years, yes. A pause. But I called a contact at the FBI field office in Fresno this morning. They've been watching Morrison for 14 months. The information hit her like a physical thing. 14 months, she repeated. There's an existing investigation. Your case didn't start it, it accelerated it. They were building something slowly, carefully trying not to tip Morrison off. Your footage forced their timeline. His voice shifted. Emily, the FBI, wants to meet with you. Today, if possible. She sat down on her couch. She was still in her work clothes apron in her hand, and she sat down on the couch because her legs had made that decision for her. What do they want from me? Information. Testimony. They want to know everything you've seen, everyone you've talked to, everything Morrison or his people have said or done since Tuesday morning. A pause. And they want to discuss the storage unit tip because it's not the first time that location has come up in their investigation. She was very quiet for a moment. Is this bigger than Morrison? She said. Keller's pause was exactly a half-second too long. The FBI doesn't open a 14-month investigation into one county sheriff, he said carefully, which was not an answer, which was in its way every answer. She called Grimm. He picked up on the second ring. She told him what Keller had said. He was quiet for a moment, and she heard something in that silence, not surprise, more like the sound of a man whose suspicions had just been confirmed. Vale, he said. What about him? Vale and Morrison go back 20 years. They worked together in LA before they came up to Kern County. There were questions back then, nothing that stuck but questions. His voice was low and even. If the FBI has been watching for 14 months, they're not just watching Morrison. Vale is in this. Keller said the same thing without saying it. Yeah. A pause. Emily, I need to tell you something and I need you to hear it clearly. He stopped for a moment like he was choosing the words with precision. This just got very big. Bigger than a slap in a diner. Bigger than one corrupt sheriff. If Vale is involved, if there's a network, there are people in that network who have a lot to lose. And people with a lot to lose do unpredictable things when they feel cornered. Are you telling me to be scared? I'm telling you, be careful. There's a difference. The same distinction he'd made before, but heavier now. The FBI can protect you to a point. I can put people around you to another point. But the biggest protection you have right now is visibility. As long as the whole country is watching, they can't move on you quietly. His voice tightened just slightly. So you don't go quiet. You don't withdraw. You stay loud. I'm not real good at loud, she said. You're better than you think, he said. You've been loud for 3 days and you didn't even notice. She almost smiled. Almost. The FBI meeting was at 2 p.m. in a conference room at a law office in Fresno, chosen specifically because it was outside Kern County jurisdiction. 2 agents, a man and a woman, both mid-40s, both with a particular economy of motion that Emily had started to associate with people who were always managing more information than they showed. The woman's name was Agent Patricia Huang. She led the conversation. She was precise and thorough and asked the same questions 3 different ways, not because she wasn't listening, but because she was listening very hard and checking for consistency. At the 40-minute mark, Agent Huang set a photograph on the table. Do you recognize this man? Emily looked at it, a man in his 50s, unremarkable looking in a suit. She didn't recognize him. She said so. His name is Gerald Fitch. He's a property developer with significant holdings in Kern and Tulare counties. He has contributed to Morrison's campaign fund 3 times and to Vale's twice. Huang's voice was completely level. 7 months ago, a woman who worked for one of his development companies filed a harassment complaint against a deputy in Morrison's department. The complaint was routed through Vale's office. She paused. It disappeared. How many complaints have disappeared? Emily said. Huang looked at her colleague. Something passed between them. In 14 months of investigation, Huang said, we have documented 9 separate complaints against Morrison, against deputies in his department, and against individuals connected to Fitch's business interests that were filed through official channels in Kern County and never resulted in any action. She paused. 3 of the people who filed those complaints subsequently moved out of the area. 2 recanted. 1, and here, Huang's voice changed by exactly 1 degree, barely perceptible, but Emily caught it, was involved in a car accident 8 months ago. He survived. He now lives out of state. The room was very quiet. You think it wasn't an accident? Emily said. We think a lot of things we can't yet prove, Huang said carefully. Which is why what you've started matters, Ms. Harper. You created a public record that cannot be made to disappear. You created 11 witnesses and counting who are now on record. You created a national news story that has made this county impossible to ignore. She leaned forward slightly. But we need more. We need testimony. We need the grand jury to hear from people who were there, who saw things, who tried to report things and were silenced. She held Emily's gaze. We need you. Emily thought about standing in that diner with a coffee pot and a face that was still stinging, deciding to stay. She thought about the note under her door, the landlord's phone call, the deputies in the parking lot reading from their paper in that rehearsed way. She thought about Carol Briggs saying, I never left because I didn't want him to think he ran me out. She thought about a storage unit in Shafter and a man who couldn't sleep and 9 complaints that had disappeared into the particular silence that powerful men create around themselves when they've had enough practice. What do you need from me first? She said. Huang almost smiled. It was very brief and very real. We need your statement. Everything from Tuesday morning in as much detail as you can provide. Then we need your consent to use the footage as evidence. She paused. And then we need you to testify before a grand jury, probably within the next 10 days. 10 days, Emily said. Morrison's attorney is already moving to suppress the footage on privacy grounds. If we don't get ahead of that, he's claiming privacy, Emily said, for hitting a woman in public. He's claiming you were in a private establishment and the filming was unauthorized. Huang's voice was flat. It won't work, but it takes time to defeat, and he's buying time. He's always buying time, Emily said. That's all he's ever done. Buy time and wait for people to get tired. That's correct, Huang said, which is why we need to move faster than he expects. Emily looked at Keller. He gave her a single nod. She looked back at Huang. Then let's start, she said. She gave her statement for 2 hours and 40 minutes. She did not cry. She did not stumble. She laid out every detail of Tuesday morning with the particular precision of a woman who had spent years making herself unnoticeable, which meant she had spent years watching, and everything she had watched had lodged somewhere in her memory where she could now retrieve it with a clarity that made Agent Huang's note-taking accelerate. When she was done, Huang set her pen down. Ms. Harper, she said, I've taken a lot of statements in 14 years. That was one of the most complete and coherent I've heard. I'm a waitress, Emily said. My whole job is remembering what people asked for and making sure it gets to them correctly. I'm good at details. Huang looked at her for a moment with an expression that was professional and also underneath that something warmer and more personal. Yes, she said, I can see that. On the drive back to Bakersfield with Keller behind the wheel and the San Joaquin Valley flat and wide in every direction. Emily pressed her forehead against the passenger window and looked at the sky, which was doing nothing in particular, just being the sky gray at the edges, gold in the middle, enormous, in the way that California sky is always enormous. Her phone buzzed. A text from Grimm. How did it go? She typed. They want me in front of a grand jury in 10 days. His response came immediately. You ready? She thought about it, genuinely thought about it in the way she'd been thinking about things these past 3 days. Not quickly, not defensively, but all the way down to where the real answer lived. She typed, no, but I'm going anyway. His response was a single word, good. She put the phone in her lap and looked back out the window. 10 days, a grand jury, 9 disappeared complaints, a storage unit in Shafter, a car accident that maybe wasn't, a network of men who had spent years teaching this county that silence was the only safe option. She thought about Tuesday morning, the way the room had gone quiet after the sound of his hand, the way every person in it had decided not to see it. And then she thought about Terry saying, I saw it, and the woman from the plant, and Lou taking off his apron. One by one, small and real and not going back. That was what Morrison had never understood about silence. It doesn't end, it accumulates. And when it finally breaks, it doesn't break quietly. The car moved through the valley, Bakersfield was 40 minutes away, and somewhere in a storage unit in Shafter, something was waiting to be found. The grand jury subpoena arrived on a Monday. Keller hand-delivered it to the diner at 7:15 in the morning before the first customers came in, and he set it on the counter in front of Emily and watched her read it with the careful attention of a man who has delivered difficult documents before and knows that the moment after matters as much as the document itself. She read it twice, folded it, set it down. 10 days, she said. 8 now, they moved it up. Keller's voice was measured. Morrison's attorney filed an emergency motion to suppress the footage on Friday night. Judge Harlan denied it Saturday morning, but Morrison's team is appealing. The federal prosecutor wants you in front of the grand jury before the appeal goes to the next level. Because if the appeal succeeds, the footage becomes inadmissible in the federal proceeding, not impossible to work around, but significantly harder. He sat down on a counter stool. Emily, I need to tell you something about the storage unit. She looked up. FBI executed a search warrant Saturday evening. Shafter Facility Unit registered to a shell company that traces back through 3 layers of paperwork to a company that Gerald Fitch co-owns. He paused in the way she'd learned meant the next thing was significant. They found files, physical files, not digital paper records going back 9 years. Complaints, witness statements, internal communications, things that were supposed to have been destroyed or that officially never existed. She felt the air change in the room. And what kind of things? The kind that show a pattern. Not just Morrison deputies under him rulings that came out of Vale's office, decisions about which cases got prosecuted and which ones quietly went away. Keller's voice was controlled, but she could hear something underneath it. Something that in another man might have been excitement, but in Keller came out as the deep, serious focus of someone who has waited a long time for a particular door to open. There are names in those files, Emily. Names of people who paid to make problems disappear. Names of people whose problems got made to disappear. And there are records of payments routed carefully but traceable between Fitch's business interests and accounts connected to Morrison and Vale. The silence in the diner was complete. They were running a protection racket, Emily said. The FBI is calling it a criminal conspiracy. Bribery, obstruction of justice, abuse of power, and potentially accessory after the fact in at least 2 cases involving violence. He let that land. Your case, the slap, the footage, the public attention, it forced their hand on the timeline. They weren't ready to move yet. But once the footage went national, Morrison started making mistakes. Calling in favors too fast, putting pressure on people he had left alone before reaching out to Vale in ways that were less careful than usual. Keller's voice hardened. They got nervous. Nervous people make phone calls. Phone calls leave records. Emily was quiet for a long moment. The person who texted me about the storage unit, former deputy, his name is Ray Castillo. He left the department 26 months ago. He'd been sitting on what he knew, trying to decide whether it was survivable to come forward. Keller paused. Watching you stand in the middle of that diner and not break, he said, that was what made him decide. She absorbed that, the weight of it. The idea that someone she'd never met had been watching her not break and had used that to decide whether he could survive being brave. Is he safe? She said. FBI has him. He's cooperating fully. A pause. He's the one who knew about the storage unit. He's the one who helped Morrison move those files there 3 years ago when they started worrying the department was being watched. His voice was very quiet now. He's been living with that for 3 years. She thought about a man who couldn't sleep. She hoped he was sleeping now. The 8 days before the grand jury were the longest and shortest of Emily Harper's life simultaneously. Long because every hour had something in it, a phone call, a decision, a new piece of information that rearranged everything she thought she understood. Short because the days collapsed into each other the way days do when you're moving too fast to mark their edges. Morrison's attorney, a man named Philip Strand, who had the particular smoothness of someone paid very well to be smooth, gave 3 separate press statements in those 8 days. Each one was a variation on the same theme. Emily was unstable, motivated by personal grievance, being manipulated by outside forces. And here Strand was carefully not specific, but the implication drifted toward Grimm and the club, which was deliberate, and that Morrison, a man with 11 years of dedicated service to Kern County, deserved the presumption of innocence that any citizen deserved. The presumption of innocence for a man on video hitting a woman. Emily heard that phrase so many times in those 8 days that it started to lose its shape the way any word does if you repeat it long enough. She had to keep reminding herself what it actually meant and what it didn't mean, because Strand was very good at blurring that line. Vale's press conference happened on day 3. He stood at a podium looking like a man who had spent a great deal of time in front of podiums and knew exactly which angle was most flattering. And he said that the investigation into Morrison was politically motivated, that the FBI's involvement was an overreach of federal authority into a local matter, and that the people of Kern County should be deeply concerned about outside forces trying to dictate how their county was governed. He was good. Emily gave him that. He was very, very good. Grimm watched the press conference on his phone at the diner counter and said nothing for a full minute after it ended. Then he said, "He's scared." "He doesn't look scared," Emily said. "That's what scared looks like when you've been doing it professionally for 20 years. Grimm set his phone down. "He's talking about the people of Kern County. He hasn't done that before. That's a campaign speech, not a legal defense. He's thinking about what comes after, which means he knows what's coming." "What's coming?" Grimm looked at her steadily. "You, in front of that grand jury, telling the truth on the record." He paused. For a man like Vale, the worst thing that can happen isn't being caught. It's being made ordinary, being shown as what he actually is, not a powerful man, not a public servant, just a person who made a long series of corrupt choices because he thought no one would ever make him account for them. His voice was very even. "You're going to make him account for them." She wanted to feel as certain as he sounded. She wasn't there yet. On day 5, Vale made his move against her. It didn't come through official channels. It came through a blogger, a local political commentary site that had maybe 3,000 regular readers and a reputation for being friendly to the county establishment. The post went up at 11 p.m. and by morning had been picked up and amplified by several larger conservative outlets. The post contained Emily's ex-boyfriend's name. It contained screenshots of public social media posts he'd made 3 years ago, including the ones where he'd called her volatile, said she'd attacked him, said she had serious psychological problems. All of it was his words, his framing, his version of a story where he had been the one making her life dangerous. But presented without context, without the police reports, without the restraining order she'd eventually gotten, it looked like evidence of exactly what Morrison and Vale had been trying to paint her as. It also contained, and this was the part that made her hands shake when she read it at 6 in the morning, her home address. She called Keller before she called anyone else. He was already awake. "I saw it. Your address, we're working on getting that taken down. In the meantime, you don't go home alone tonight." "They put my address online." "I know. That's Keller. That's not a legal strategy. That's a threat." "I know what it is." His voice was tight in a way she hadn't heard before. "I'm documenting everything. Every piece of this is going to the FBI and to the federal prosecutor, and I want you to know that this kind of intimidation, this targeting of a witness before grand jury testimony, that is itself a federal crime. Tell that to whoever's going to show up at my apartment." "Nobody is showing up at your apartment," Grimm said, and she startled. She'd put Keller on speaker and hadn't heard Grimm's call come in on the other line, or maybe she had called them both simultaneously in her panic. She couldn't remember, but Grimm's voice was there, low and certain. "I've got 4 guys on your building right now," he said. "They've been there since 10 last night. Nobody gets to your door." She sat down on the floor of her kitchen, back against the cabinet's phone in both hands. She was not going to fall apart. She had made a decision about that, but the floor felt necessary right now. "They put my address online," she said again, not to either of them specifically. Just out loud, because it needed to be said out loud to become real and then to become something she could manage. "Emily," Grimm's voice, quiet and direct, "look at what they just did." "I know what they did." "No, look at why they did it. They put your address online 5 days before you testify. That is not the move of a man who is winning. That is the move of a man who is out of legal options and has moved to the only tool he has left." A pause. "They are terrified of you." She sat on her kitchen floor for another moment. Then she stood up. She called Sandra Reeves. "The blog post," she said, "I want to respond publicly today." Sandra's voice sharpened immediately. "Are you sure Keller will be on this call?" but I want to respond before this has 24 hours to breathe. I want my response out before lunch. A pause. I'll have a camera at the diner in an hour. She told Keller. He argued for exactly 90 seconds, then shifted to making sure the statement said what it needed to say and nothing that could be used against her in the grand jury room. They drafted it together on the phone, she walking back and forth across her kitchen, he at his desk in his office. Both of them finding the words that were true and strategic at the same time. She stood in Lou's diner at 9:15 in the morning, Sandra's camera on a tripod in front of her, and she read the statement she and Keller had written. She did not read it from paper. She had memorized it. 3 years ago, I left a dangerous relationship. I called the police. I got a restraining order. I did what women are told to do. Last night, someone published my home address online, which is a crime alongside that man's version of that story with the clear intent of making me afraid. She paused. It worked. I was afraid this morning. And then I remembered that I have been afraid before and that I got through it, and that the only reason those men put my address online is because they are more afraid of my testimony than I am of their intimidation. She looked directly at the camera. I will be in front of that grand jury in 5 days. I will tell the truth. And I want every woman watching this who has ever had her story rewritten by the person who hurt her. I want you to know that your truth is still the truth, no matter how many times someone tries to bury it. The video went up at 10 a.m. By noon, it had 3 million views. By evening, the blogger who had published her address had deleted the post and issued a statement saying it had been submitted anonymously and that they had not verified the information before publishing, which was both an admission of negligence and, reading between the lines, a very fast attempt to distance themselves from whoever had sent them the post. The FBI traced the submission within 48 hours. It had come from a device registered to a deputy in Morrison's department. Strand gave no press statement that evening. Vale gave no press statement. The silence from their side was, Keller said when he called her that night, extremely informative. The grand jury convened on a Thursday morning. Emily wore a dark blue blazer over a white shirt that she'd pressed the night before, and her hair down for once, and the flat shoes that didn't have the separated sole because she'd finally bought the super glue and fixed it, which felt like a small but specific victory. Keller met her outside and walked in with her and told her 3 things right before they went through the doors. Tell the truth, answer only what's asked, and if you don't know something, say you don't know it, never guess, never fill silence with speculation. She nodded. She went in. The grand jury room was smaller than she'd expected. 23 people in the jury seats. Ordinary people, the kind you'd see at Lou's on any given morning, retired folks and working people, and a woman about Emily's age who had the look of someone who had rearranged her whole week to be here and was taking it very seriously. The federal prosecutor, a compact man named Gerald Torres, who had the quiet confidence of someone who had done this many times, sat at the front. Emily sat down. She folded her hands on the table. She waited. Torres began. He took her through Tuesday morning in the diner methodically from the moment Morrison walked in to the moment the door swung shut behind him. He asked about each exchange, each escalation, each word. He asked her to describe the moment of the slap in as much detail as she could provide. She did clearly and without drama the way she'd practiced, and as she spoke, she watched the faces of the jurors and she saw something moving in them. Recognition, maybe, or the particular discomfort of hearing something true, described plainly. Then Torres introduced the footage. They watched it together, all of them, in that small room. 2 minutes and 47 seconds that Emily had watched so many times by now, that she knew every frame, and yet watching it in this room with these 23 people was seeing it for the first time. It was different. She watched their faces. The moment the slap happened, one older woman in the back row closed her eyes briefly. A man in the middle row leaned forward. The young woman who had rearranged her week pressed her lips together very tight. Nobody said anything. The room was completely silent when it ended. Torres moved to the wider investigation. He asked Emily about the contacts Keller's office had received, and she answered what she knew directly and deferred to Keller's documentation on the rest. He asked about the intimidation, the notes, the deputies in the parking lot, the blog post, the address. She laid it out in sequence, calmly, every date and detail she could provide. Then Torres said, Ms. Harper, are you aware that prior to this investigation, 9 complaints were filed in Kern County relating to Sheriff Morrison or officers under his command, and that none of those complaints resulted in any disciplinary action? I am aware of that, yes. And are you aware that at least 3 of the individuals who filed those complaints subsequently withdrew them, moved out of the area, or faced circumstances that were adverse to their continued participation in any formal proceeding? Yes. Given that knowledge, can you tell this jury why you chose not to withdraw your own complaint, why you chose to testify today? She looked at Torres, then she looked at the jury, all 23 faces watching her. Because someone had to be the first one who didn't, she said. She said it simply, without decoration. And she watched it land in that room the way something lands when it is completely and purely true. Torres let the silence hold for a moment. "Thank you, Ms. Harper," he said. "No further questions." She walked out of the grand jury room at 11:42 a.m. Keller was waiting in the hallway. He looked at her face, and whatever he saw there made him exhale slowly. "Good," he said. "I think so," she said. Her phone was buzzing before she was out the door. Sandra, Grimm, Carol Briggs, numbers she recognized and numbers she didn't, stacking up while she'd been inside for 2 hours telling the truth to 23 strangers. She didn't look at them yet. She stood in the hallway outside the grand jury room and pressed her back against the wall and took 3 deep breaths, and she thought about a Tuesday morning 3 weeks ago when she had stood in the center of a diner with a stinging face and made the decision. A small decision, it had felt like just the decision to stay that had somehow led her here. Keller's phone rang. He answered, listened for 30 seconds, and his expression changed in a way that was controlled, but not controlled enough to hide from someone who'd spent 3 weeks learning to read him. "What?" she said. He lowered the phone. His voice was careful and precise and barely covering something that was the attorney version of stunned. "Federal marshals arrested Robert Vale 40 minutes ago," he said. His office in front of his staff. "They took him out in handcuffs." A pause. "Morrison's attorney has contacted the prosecutor's office to discuss a possible plea arrangement." The hallway was very quiet. Emily thought about Vale at his podium, so polished, talking about the people of Kern County. She thought about 9 disappeared complaints. She thought about a man who was trying to decide whether it was survivable to be brave and watching her not break and deciding yes. She thought about the note under her door. "You should think about whether Bakersfield is still the right place for you." She thought, "I thought about it. I'm staying." "What happens now?" she said. "Now," Keller said, "we go to trial." She nodded. She put her phone in her pocket, still buzzing. She looked at the door at the end of the hallway, the one that led back outside, back to Bakersfield, back to Lou's Diner, and the counter, and the coffee pot, and the people who had one by one chosen to see what they saw. She walked toward it. Behind her, the grand jury was still deliberating. Ahead of her, a trial was coming. And somewhere in a courtroom that didn't exist yet, Dale Morrison was going to have to sit across from everything he'd done and look at it without the power to make it disappear. She pushed through the door into the California afternoon. Grimm was leaning against his bike in the parking lot, arms crossed, watching the door like he'd known exactly when she'd come through it. Behind him, 2 of his guys were sitting on their bikes, saying nothing, just present. He looked at her face. "Well," he said. "Vale's in custody," she said. "Morrison's talking plea." He was quiet for a moment. "Then how do you feel?" She thought about it honestly. She felt exhausted and wired, and something else. Something she didn't have an immediate word for, the particular sensation of a person who has been carrying something very heavy for a very long time and has just set it down, not because it's gone, but because other hands have taken part of the weight. "Like it's not over," she said. "It's not," he agreed, "but like maybe the worst part is." He considered that. "The worst part of a storm is never the lightning," he said. "It's the waiting before and the cleaning up after." He looked at her for a moment. "You did the waiting. The cleanup is easier with more people." She almost smiled. "Is that biker philosophy?" "That's just philosophies," he said. "Bikers didn't invent common sense. We just have more time to think about it on the road." She did smile then, small and real and tired and genuine. She got in Keller's car. She looked out the window as they pulled out of the parking lot, and she watched Grimm on his bike, 3 men following, pulling out behind them, in the easy, unhurried way of people who are exactly where they intend to be. Morrison was talking plea deals. Vale was in custody. The files from Shafter were in federal hands. And somewhere in the stack of missed calls on her phone, there were 11 people and more she hadn't met yet who had chosen to say, "I saw it," because she had said it first. The trial was coming. She had never been less afraid of something in her life. Morrison's plea deal fell apart on a Wednesday. Keller called Emily at 7 in the morning, and she knew from the first syllable of his voice that something had shifted, not broken, but shifted the way the ground shifts before something either settles or gives way entirely. He withdrew, Keller said. His attorney contacted the prosecutor's office last night. Morrison is rejecting the plea arrangement and going to trial. Emily sat with that for a moment. Why? Because Vale's attorney called his attorney. Keller's voice was precise and careful. Vale is fighting extradition on the federal charges. He's arguing jurisdiction, which is a losing argument, but it buys time. And someone told Morrison that if he takes a plea, he's on his own. But if he goes to trial and Vale's case is still unresolved, there's a chance, a small one, that the whole thing gets complicated enough that both of them walk away with less than they deserve. He thinks he can still win. He thinks he can create enough confusion that the jury can't be certain. Keller paused. Philip Strand is good, Emily. I want you to know what you're walking into. Tell me. He's going to put you on the stand as a hostile witness in Morrison's defense case. He's going to ask about your ex, about the police reports, about every public statement you've made in the last month and a half. He's going to try to show that you have a pattern of conflict with authority figures, that you were verbally aggressive toward Morrison before he made physical contact, and that the footage, because of the angle and the compression, doesn't definitively show what actually happened. A beat. He's going to try to make 12 people in a jury box wonder if maybe they're not entirely sure. Emily was quiet for a moment. The footage shows exactly what happened. I know that. You know that. Strand's job is to make 3 jurors doubt it. His voice tightened. Reasonable doubt is a very small gap to fit a very large lie through. Strand has done it before. She thought about 9 disappeared complaints. She thought about 3 people who had withdrawn, and 2 who had moved away, and 1 who had been in a car accident. He's not going to make me doubt what I know, she said. I know he's not, but I needed you to hear what's coming. She went to the diner. She worked her shift. She poured coffee and took orders and said, "You're welcome, and I'll be right back." And the familiar rhythm of it, the weight of the pot, the squeak of her shoes on the linoleum, the particular sound of Lou's grill was something she held on to, not because she was afraid of what was coming, but because she wanted to remember who she was before she walked into that courtroom. She wanted to stay connected to the woman who woke up at 4:47 and fixed her shoe with super glue and was tired in ways that didn't show. That woman was the one the jury needed to see. Grimm came in at 9. He didn't say anything about the plea falling through. He probably already knew. He ordered his coffee and his toast and sat at the counter, and after a while he said without looking up, "How are you sleeping?" "Better than I expected," she said. "Good." He turned the cup. "Trial starts Monday." "I know. Strand is going to come after you hard on that stand. Keller told me." "Keller's right." Grimm looked up at her then. "I've watched men like Strand work. They're not looking for the truth. They're looking for the moment you flinch. One flinch, just one, and they build a whole story around it." His voice was level. "Don't flinch." "I haven't yet." "No," he said, "you haven't." The trial of Dale Morrison, former sheriff of Kern County, began on a Monday morning 6 weeks after the slap in Lou's diner. The courtroom was packed in a way that courtrooms in Bakersfield almost never were pressed in the gallery, a line outside that had formed before 6 a.m. A satellite truck parked on the street that Emily walked past on her way in without looking at it. She wore the same dark blue blazer. She'd thought about wearing something different and decided against it. She wanted to be recognizable as herself. Keller walked in beside her. On the courthouse steps, she stopped for a moment, not because she was hesitating, but because she wanted to feel the specific weight of this moment to make it real before she went inside so that she could carry it clearly through what was coming. Carol Briggs was standing at the bottom of the courthouse steps. She had driven 2 hours from where she'd moved since filing her new statement, and she was wearing her good coat. And she looked at Emily with the expression of someone who knows exactly what another person is walking into because they wished for 3 years that they had walked into it themselves. "I'll be in the gallery," Carol said, "the whole time." Emily nodded. She didn't trust herself to say much. Ray Castillo was there too, the former deputy who hadn't been able to sleep. He was a compact man in his 40s, with a face that looked like it had been carrying weight for a long time, and he gave Emily a nod that was brief and serious and contained an apology and a solidarity that neither of them needed to put into words. She went inside. The prosecution's case took 4 days. Torres was methodical and thorough and presented the footage, the physical evidence, the testimony of witnesses from the diner, the documentation from Keller's office, and the records from the Shafter storage unit, the 9 disappeared complaints, the payment trails, the communications between Morrison and Vale that showed not one impulsive act in a diner, but a deliberate and sustained system of intimidation and corruption. Morrison sat at the defense table and watched all of it with the particular stillness of a man who has decided that the best performance available to him is no performance at all. Just stillness. Just the face of a man who is waiting for his turn. His turn came on day 5. Strand was exactly what Keller had warned her he would be. He moved through the courtroom with the ease of a man who was comfortable there, and he started not with the footage, but with Emily's past. He called her ex-boyfriend's social media posts into evidence. He called the police reports, all of them, including the ones where she was the victim, and he read from them in a tone that was perfectly neutral, the neutrality itself doing the work of insinuation. He asked about the relationship with Grimm, about the club, about whether Emily had been coached on what to say. He asked about every public statement she'd made, every interview. Every word of her grand jury testimony, looking for inconsistencies, finding none but making the search itself visible. And then he called Emily to the stand. She walked up, she sat down, she looked at Strand, and then she looked at the jury, all 12 of them, ordinary people, Bakersfield people, and she settled herself. Strand began pleasantly. Ms. Harper, you've described yourself publicly as a simple waitress who was minding her own business on the morning of October 14th. Is that accurate? I was working my shift, yes. And you described the morning as routine before Sheriff Morrison arrived? Yes. Now, Ms. Harper, isn't it true that you have a history of conflict with men in positions of authority? Keller was on his feet. Objection, vague and prejudicial. I'll rephrase, Strand said smoothly. Ms. Harper, in your previous relationship, the one you've publicly discussed, were there instances where law enforcement was called to intervene? Oh, so. Yes, I called them. You called them? Strand repeated, letting it sit. And isn't it true that your former partner made statements suggesting that you had been the aggressor in certain confrontations during that relationship? He made statements. Yes, he also violated a restraining order twice. She kept her voice even. The police reports reflect what actually happened. The police reports reflect what you told the police. The police reports reflect what the police observed and documented, she said, including injuries, which were on me. A small sound from the gallery. Strand moved on quickly. He spent 40 minutes with her. He went at the footage, asking about the angle, the compression, whether she was absolutely certain the contact was as forceful as she described, whether in the heat of the moment she might have perceived something as harder than it was. He went at her relationship with Grimm, suggesting that a woman allied with the president of a motorcycle club might have complicated motivations. He went at her public statements, pointing out that she had spoken to the media before the grand jury, suggesting that her testimony had been shaped by the narrative she'd already committed to publicly. She answered every question. She did not flinch. When Strand said, "Isn't it possible, Ms. Harper, that what you perceived as a threatening strike was in fact an involuntary reaction? A man startled, moving his hand quickly contact that was accidental rather than intentional." She looked at him for a moment. "No," she said, "it's not possible. How can you be so certain?" "Because I felt it," she said. "I've been hit before, not by accident. I know the difference." The courtroom was absolutely still. Strand paused. In that pause, Emily watched him decide something. He had pushed as far as this line would take him. Going further would make the jury sympathize with her more completely, and he knew it. "No further questions," he said. She stepped down from the stand. She walked back to the gallery and sat beside Keller, and she felt for the first time since she'd walked into that courtroom the particular release of a person who has done the hardest thing available to them and found that they could do it. Keller leaned close and said quietly, "That was perfect." She said nothing. She was watching Morrison. He was watching her too. For the first time since the trial began, his stillness had broken slightly, something moving in his jaw. His eyes, a man recalculating what he'd believed about this woman and finding that his calculations had been wrong from the start. The twist that nobody in the courtroom had anticipated came on day 7. Strand had rested the defense case the previous afternoon, and Torres was conducting redirect when his assistant came through the side door of the courtroom and passed him a note. Torres read it. His expression did not change in any dramatic way. It changed in the way that very controlled people's expressions change when they're managing something significant, a slight tightening around the eyes, a brief cessation of movement. He requested a 15-minute recess. Emily looked at Keller. Keller looked at his phone, which had just buzzed. He read the message. He turned to Emily with an expression she had never seen on him before, something that was, if you knew where to look, very close to joy. "Val," he said, "his extradition fight failed this morning. He's in federal custody as of 1 hour ago, and his attorney trying to negotiate a deal before he's formally arraigned provided federal prosecutors with documentation." He paused. "Including records of direct communications between Vale and Morrison on the night of October 14th, the night after the slap." She stared at him. "What kind of communications?" "The kind where Vale tells Morrison specifically to create a record against you, to file the false complaint, to have deputies approach you, to begin building the narrative that you were unstable." His voice was very quiet and very precise. It wasn't Morrison improvising. It was coordinated. Vale directed the retaliation against you in writing within 18 hours of the footage being recorded. The recess lasted 20 minutes, not 15. When Torres came back, he moved immediately to introduce the newly obtained communications as evidence under the federal proceedings discovery rules. Strand objected. The judge overruled him. The communications were read into the record. The jury heard Vale's words to Morrison, in Vale's own voice, from a recording of a phone call made at 9:47 p.m. on October 14th. "We need to get ahead of this tonight. She needs to look crazy before that footage goes anywhere. File something against her erratic behavior, possible substance issue. Get deputies on her tomorrow morning. We've handled worse than this. We've handled worse than this. 9 complaints, 3 withdrawals, 2 relocations, 1 car accident." The jury heard those words and looked at Morrison, and Morrison, for the first time, looked at something other than perfectly still. Strand asked for another recess. The judge gave him 30 minutes. During those 30 minutes, Strand spoke with Morrison in a room off the main corridor. Emily sat in the hallway with Keller and Carol Briggs and Ray Costello, and none of them said much, and the silence was the particular silence of people waiting for something to resolve. When Strand came back out, he went directly to the prosecutor's table. The conversation between him and Torres lasted 4 minutes. The judge was called back. Morrison changed his plea to guilty on 3 counts: criminal assault, obstruction of justice, and conspiracy. He did not look at Emily when he said the words. He looked at the table in front of him, and his voice was flat and final, the voice of a man who had run every calculation available to him and found that they all led to the same place. The judge set sentencing for 30 days out. Based on the federal guidelines Torres outlined, Morrison was looking at a minimum of 4 years. Vale, under the federal charges, was facing significantly more. The courtroom erupted. Not dramatically, not the way it happens in movies with cheering and chaos. More like the sound of 20 people all exhaling at once, a collective release of something that had been held tight for a very long time. Carol Briggs put her hand over her mouth. Ray Castillo looked at the ceiling. Keller sat very still with his eyes closed for exactly 3 seconds. Emily sat in her seat and looked at the front of the courtroom where Morrison was being spoken to by his attorney, and she felt she tried to identify what she felt not triumph exactly. Something quieter, something that had more to do with the 9 disappeared complaints than with the verdict, more to do with Carol's voice shaking and then steadying on a phone call than with Morrison's face when he said guilty. She felt like something had been returned. Not to her specifically, to all of them. She went back to the diner that afternoon, not because she had a shift. Lou had taken her off the schedule for trial week, but because she wanted to. Because it was where it had started, and it felt right that some version of the ending should happen there too. Lou was behind the counter. He looked up when she came in, and he didn't say anything at first, just looked at her with the expression of a man who has spent 30 years keeping his head down and is in the complicated process of deciding that's over. Then he said, "Coffee, please," she said. She sat at the counter, and Lou poured her coffee, and they sat in a comfortable silence that was different from the silence of October 14th, different from the held breath silence of people who had decided not to see something. This was the silence of two people who were on the same side and didn't need to fill it with words. Grim came in 20 minutes later. Just him, alone, no other bikes outside. He sat on the stool beside her, nodded at Luce, got his coffee. He looked at her for a moment. "How do you feel?" he said. "You asked me that in the parking lot after the grand jury," she said. "I'm asking again." She thought about it. "Like I have a lot of work to do," she said. He raised an eyebrow. "The stand-up foundation," she said. It was something she and Keller had been quietly building the framework for during the weeks of the trial, a legal aid and advocacy organization for victims of police misconduct and abuse. It had a name now. It had the beginning of a structure, a board forming a website in draft. The settlement from the civil suit she was filing against Kern County would fund the first 2 years of operations. There are people in counties all over California, all over this country, who filed complaints that disappeared, who moved away because they were told it was safer, who tried to come forward and got their addresses published online and their past weaponized against them. She looked at Grim. Carol Briggs said she never left because she didn't want him to think he'd run her out. There are 1,000 Carol Briggses, and most of them don't have a Keller or a Castillo or, she paused, or a man in a corner booth who stands up. Grim was quiet for a moment. "You're going to need legal infrastructure, partnerships with law schools, hotlines. I know some people who can help with the physical safety side of things, safe housing, temporary relocation when someone needs to get out of a situation." He said it carefully, not with the weight of an offer, but with the practicality of a man solving a logistics problem. "Not just my guys, I know people in other cities." She looked at him. "You do that?" "I've been doing it quietly for years," he said, in ways that didn't have a name or a structure. "You'd be giving it both." He picked up his coffee. "That seems worth doing." She nodded. 1 year after the slap to the day, Emily Harper walked into Lou's diner at 6:30 in the morning. Not for a shift. She hadn't waitressed there in 4 months. Lou had a new morning person, a woman named Grace, who was 22 and sharp as a tack, and whom Emily had personally recommended, and whom Lou had hired on the spot because he trusted Emily's judgment completely now. Emily came in because she had been invited. Lou had called her the week before and said simply, "October 14th, come in. I'm making breakfast," which from Lou was approximately equivalent to a declaration of love. The diner was different and exactly the same. The booth in the corner where Grim had sat was the corner booth. The counter stools were the same stools. The coffee was still the color of motor oil. The burned-out letter on the sign outside had been replaced. Lou had finally fixed it sometime in the spring, though he hadn't mentioned it to anyone. Carol Briggs was there seated at the window booth. Ray Castillo was at the counter. Sandra Reeves was there with her notebook closed off duty, just present. Terry the trucker was there, and the 2 women from the plant and the retired men who had pulled out their phones. They were all just people having breakfast. Ordinary people who had made one choice, each of them, on one morning, to see what they saw and then to say so. Grim came in last. He sat at the counter, ordered his coffee, looked around at the room with those November eyes, and gave the small nod of a man who is exactly where he intends to be. Emily stood at the center of the diner. The same place she'd stood when she'd faced the room full of reporters and regulars and said there were hard years. The same linoleum, the same light. She looked at all of them. "I want to say something," she said. "I'm not good at speeches. You all know that." A small, real laugh from around the room. "A year ago, I was standing right here after the worst morning of my working life trying to decide whether to go home." She paused. "Lou told me my shift was paid. He said I didn't have to stay." She looked at Lou, who was behind the service window, not pretending to be busy with anything. "I stayed because I was angry, honestly, and because I was tired of running from things." She looked around the room. "But what I didn't know yet, what I understand now, is that staying was never just about me. It was about the 11 people who called Keller's office. It was about Carol, who never left this county because she refused to let Morrison take it from her. It was about Ray, who couldn't sleep and finally decided the cost of speaking was less than the cost of silence." She stopped for a moment. Her voice was completely steady. "Morrison is serving 4 years. Vale is in federal custody facing 7 to 10. Gerald Fitch is under federal indictment. And the Stand Up Foundation has already assisted 31 people in 9 California counties who were exactly where we were a year ago, sitting on something true, trying to figure out if it was survivable to say it. 31 people. She knew each of their names. I was invisible for a long time, she said. I was good at it. I thought it was the safest way to live. She looked at Grimm for a moment, and he was watching her with that expression she'd come to know, not proud exactly, more like witnessing, like a man who sees something clearly and is glad to see it. Turns out the safest thing I ever did was the loudest. Carol Briggs was crying quietly. She wasn't trying to hide it. Terry said roughly, "You going to let Lou cook, or are we going to stand around all morning?" The room laughed. Real laughter, the kind that comes from relief and recognition, and the particular warmth of people who have been through something together and made it to the other side. Emily sat down at the counter. Lou put a plate in front of her, eggs, over medium whole wheat toast, side of fruit, cooked exactly right. She looked at the plate. She looked at the room. She thought about 4:47 in the morning and forced smiles and cheap coffee and the particular exhaustion of a life spent making herself small. She picked up her fork. She had spent 29 years learning to be invisible and 1 year learning what happened when she refused to be. She had learned that silence protects no one, that fear is a wall that only looks like a shelter, and that the most dangerous thing a frightened woman can do to the men who depend on her fear is simply refuse to be afraid anymore. Morrison had walked into a diner one October morning, expecting a room full of people who would look away. He had found one woman who didn't, and that had been enough. That had been everything.